Okay, let's say I'm a rival. I'm China, and I'm thinking, okay, I want to defeat the US over the next 30 years. I can do it with aircraft carriers and planes
Yes,
and tanks. Very expensive, very risky.
yes.
Or I can take a fraction of that money and pour it into exacerbating these exact differences that you're talking about, and they will start fighting themselves.
My theory is that if you're China, you're funding the net zero cultists, you're funding the BLMs and pro-Palestine and all of these assorted kinds of groups. You're funding the feminists. You're funding the transgender lobby. You're funding the LGBT lobby in general, with the intent of destabilizing Western societies. This is something that the Soviets had spoken about, the use of subversion to demoralize a society and to bring about its collapse.
The Yuri Bezmenov stuff.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. And if you're China, you have no reason to abandon this playbook. And you have every interest in funding these extremists, these very nasty, very committed extremists.
Well, and they've just
And
got
the
a big...
irony is that they were being funded by US aid as well.
yes, that as well. But I mean, they've just got a big boost in Canada, haven't they, with the Liberals winning, and
Yes.
China immediately came out with a statement, words to the effect of, "We look forward to further strengthening our deep relationships with the Canadian power elite." Something like that.
Because Carney sees China as a lesser threat than America, which, from
Is he right?
a very narrow standpoint, if he doesn't care about his people at all, and if he cares about only his own power base, then he's right. If he gives a damn about Canadians being primarily British and French and people who've been integrated into North American British and North American French cultures, then no, he's wrong. But we know that the likes of Carney are only interested in their own well-being and don't even recognize their people or as a nation.
So explain to me what the Chinese strategy is for getting their hooks in, because we've witnessed them do it in Africa through basically buying stuff and building stuff.
Mhm.
We're witnessing them doing it in Australia with, I mean, they're building out mines and ports and their own road networks, their own rail networks and stuff. Is it something similar to like that to get their hooks into Canada and start to peel it away?
There are people who know a lot more about this than I do. So I don't pretend to know the details of the Chinese influence in Canada. But you can see it in some of the mining companies that are listed on the Toronto Stock Exchange. You can see it in the sheer extent of money laundering in Vancouver that happens in relationship with the Chinese. You can see it with the way that they're buying up properties and buying up assets up and down Canada. And you could see it in the fact that the Canadian intelligence tried to cover up the extent of Chinese penetration of Canadian intelligence, which would suggest that there's a deep compromising of the whole system in Canada. But there are people who are more qualified to talk about this than I am.
But I guess what that brings me to is we've recently had the whole discussion around tariffs.
Yes.
Now, my perspective on that was that this was something that so it was presented as a trade thing. It was presented as a jobs thing. My thoughts was that this had to be driven primarily as a national security thing, and it was primarily an anti-China thing. What was your perspective on it?
That they were trying to do a lot of things at the same time with some blunt instruments. This isn't to accept the argument that there can be a surgical approach to tariffs. That's just not true, given the size of trade.
So there had been attempts over the last 30 years to do the surgical thing.
Yes.
Never worked.
It just doesn't work.
Yeah.
It just doesn't work. So some things do require a blunt instrument. If you're hammering things with a sword, that's pretty stupid. So blunt instruments do have a place in our lives and in politics. That said, I think what the ideal outcome for somebody like Trump, given the different intersections of political allegiances that are around him and given his own beliefs, is that you've got to make these countries pay for their own defense and not subsidize them for defense, and partner with them on that in that way. And you've got to get them to trade with you fairly, if not freely. So if they're not going to give your agricultural producers access, you should reciprocate. So this is the animating principle, as far as I can tell. Trade, by its very nature, works best between countries, works best for the average citizen, between countries that have similar levels of income. If you have a massive gap in income between one country and another that are trading together, then the low-income country, once this massive richer market is open to it, stands to benefit a lot more than the high-income country. So the extension of that would be that what Trump would want to do is to get into a free trade arrangement with culturally compatible countries that have similar levels of income, which would point to Europe, Japan, and maybe South Korea, and obviously Canada and Britain, as being the countries that are the most natural fit for free trade and for shared defense, because there is an overlap of interests, and there is an overlap of security needs, and an overlap of perceived threats, and an overlap of culture, especially North America, Britain, Europe. The issue is that European leaders don't see it that way, because they're mainly interested in their own parochial interests. And that's fair, because all politics is parochial, but that comes with a cost, because you have China, which is a behemoth in manufacturing and in population terms, that's eating all of your lunches.
Is Europe not? Does Europe show any signs to you of thinking long term strategically about the interplay with China?
No. The Germany is willing to pretty much sell everything to the Chinese just to get through the next quarter with absolutely no long-term thinking whatsoever.
I mean, they were doing that with the Russians until very recently, when
they were doing
the
it
chip
with the
in
Russians.
the back of their NPC brain got changed, and all of a sudden they kind of cut their own legs off.
Essentially. The problem that Europe has is that these aren't serious people leading it. And it's a consequence, perhaps, of Europeans becoming so distant from who they are and their identity, ethnically and religiously. Liberalism has rotted the minds of Europeans, translating into just a collapse across the board, from the family
certainly true.
to local politics to national politics. And these are linked, and these are tied together by faith and by ethnic identity. And Westerners don't seem to recognize how the world works. They don't want to.
Too comfortable too long.
Too comfortable for too long. Too comfortable for too long. There haven't been real challenges, and the state has come in and replaced the family. You get cradle-to-grave welfare.
I prefer to call it cradle-to-grave atomization.
That's exactly the same thing.
Keeping us apart.
That's exactly the same thing.
Everywhere else in the world relies on the multi-generational family.
Yes.
And it works. Here we rely on a welfare state.
You have, therefore, no incentive to have children, and you have no incentive to maintain relationships with your children.
Yep.
And this is a big part of the boomer illness. They were the first generation exposed to it, and it was sold as charity. But fundamentally, the role of the state is not to provide charity. The role of the state is to repel invaders and hang criminals.
Yes.
So it's failing at these basic functions, but we're debating how much money should people get in welfare, and how much welfare should we give to foreigners.
I once did a pyramid of the functions of government, and the bottom layer is that it's basically national security is the bottom layer.
Yes.
Then it's property rights, because that then allows a market economy to emerge.
Yes.
then maybe it's infrastructure, and you go up, and at the top of the pyramid it's stuff like, working out who goes in what bathroom, and the entire pyramid has been flipped upside down, where they spend all of their energy at the narrow end of the pyramid and very little, if any, attention to the base of the pyramid.
Can you imagine how humiliating it is that the issue of whether or not men are men had to go to the Supreme Court?
Yes.
Isn't it insulting that this issue needs to even be debated?
Why is it up to the Supreme Court?
And isn't it a sign of decadence and decay?
Yeah. But flipping this back to the geopolitics, so this is something. Okay, so Europe is not aware of this.
No.
The US itself was not under the last presidency. What are you seeing in this administration that has quickly and immediately grasped that they are in a civilizational struggle with China, and they've got to do something about it? And perhaps a follow-on from that is, what actually is China's strategy here? Because from as far as I can tell, it's to basically wait for the US to destroy itself, or maybe hasten that process.
So in terms of this administration being aware of the challenges, you saw them go after these particular issues immediately on day one.
Yes.
And you saw that, I don't want to say backfiring, but you saw the opposition using that in order to dominate the media and focus the narrative on these insane issues, on these cultish issues of diversity, illegal migration, climate, etc. You're seeing this administration saying, we've got to grow the economy very quickly. We've got to rebalance trade, because you can't keep on having an endlessly negative trade balance without this coming at a price. And the price being the loss of the dollar's value. And you're seeing them focusing, okay, how are we going to build up our military and separate supply chains from China?
Well, on a fundamental level, the US should be able to fire a missile at China without that missile having its supply chain based on the Chinese.
That's an excellent summary.
Yeah.
That's a perfect summary. Exactly. So they know that they need to address this, and they seem to be working to address this. China's strategy seems to be to take advantage of the chaos in the West and not just work with countries in its own near abroad, that is Southeast Asia, Pakistan, etc., but to also work with the Canadians and the Europeans, and even extend an offer to the British, so that they could isolate America from its natural allies, so that they could break up the West politically.
I would be shocked
rather than take on the West as a whole.
I'd be shocked if China could peel Britain away, because we are deeply embedded in the American structure. But what about the rest of them? Do you think they've got a decent chance of peeling away other allies like Canada and the EU and Australia?
Look, Canada can be solved militarily, but there's no appetite for that within the existing Pentagon leadership and the existing cabinet. If it were up to Trump, I think he hinted at the possibility of, okay, just let's do this and go and invade them.
Let's just drill down on that point a little bit. What would be the lead up to something like that becoming a pressing issue? Because, I already mentioned that in Australia, China has huge mining operations, and it's built its own ports and railway infrastructure and roads and so on. If the Chinese start building their own ports, railway systems, and other basically quasi-military setups,
that could be
in Canada.
Yes, that could become a real problem. The other alternative is that they try to use the tariff issue endlessly to instigate an economic crisis in Canada, because most Canadian trade is with the United States. So keep on placing pressure on that until there's an economic crisis and until the liberal experiment in Canada fails. I mean, remember, the Canadian, I think I saw yesterday somebody claiming that nearly 5% of Canadians are immigrants with disabilities. It was an astronomical figure. I didn't verify it, but I remember it caught my eye. There's an incredible number of foreign students who are living in Canada. 1 in 40 Canadians, is the people living in Canada, as a foreign student. So there are these deep instabilities within Canada that if you pair them with economic pressure and try to make everything worse for Canada, this rallying around the flag effect will begin to crumble as a result of internal conflicts within Canada herself.
Well, that's almost suggesting that short term it was a loss that the Libs retook Canada.
Yes.
But actually it might be a better forcing function longer term, because it's going to make the Libs own their mistakes.
And you can't have the level of demographic change that the Canadians are having without it coming at a price. This idea that you can just bring in more Indians, more Pakistanis, more Chinese, and it's all going to be absolutely fine, is crazy. But the corollary of it is that given the citizenship laws in Canada, this is changing the demographics of who's voting.
And Pierre Poilievre loses his seat.
So you end up in a situation where you can instigate a crisis of such an extent that the actual Canadians, who are descended of the British and the French, say, just, we've had it.
If you would like to see the full version of this premium video, please head over to lotuseaters.com and subscribe to gain full access to all of our premium content.